In the courthouse hallway, my brother leaned toward his attorney and said, almost laughing, "She won't show up in court." He meant the notary who could have tied his neat trick to the ground like a tent stake. He meant the one person he believed he had frightened into silence. I was 3 benches away, the hum of the fluorescent lights droning over my head, a manila folder warm in my hands from how long I'd been holding it. Inside lay the paper with my name on it, not in my hand, a signature made of my bones and not my wrist. I looked at him only once, just long enough to see the confidence ride along his jaw like a new coat of paint, and then at the scuffed tile between my shoes. I let him think the hallway was his. The building smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper. Somewhere down the corridor, someone laughed too loudly, and then remembered where they were. A bailiff's shoes passed slow and certain on the waxed floor. My heart did not race. There's a quiet that comes over a man who has already buried both parents and held the family keys so long he knows how each one bites the palm. I breathed through it, the way you breathe through a cold morning before the truck warms up, a little fog leaving the body every time you exhale. My name, written like a costume, lay under my fingers. It would do its work. I didn't need to do mine with my mouth. I know signatures. For 30 years, I notarized deeds and lien releases and durable powers that decided how a stranger would be fed in a hospital bed when they could no longer choose. The human hand has habits. It can't hide hesitations at a curve. A heavier downstroke on the first letter, after a pause, spacing that narrows when someone's lying to themselves. The one inside my folder wore my letters like a borrowed suit. The E in Edward rose too proudly. In my true hand it sits down, practical, as if it knows there's more work to do. The D in Mallory had a loop that belonged to someone who learned cursive from a different teacher in a different year. My brother has always been a right-hander who hooks his wrist and drags a little shadow of ink to the right. You could feel the pressure on that loop with your fingertip. The date above it smudged, the way ink smudges when a man signs, then slides the page toward himself before it's dry. He never knew I'd been paying attention while he wrote checks at the kitchen table. He never knew attention was the part of me he couldn't steal. The first time I caught the scent of betrayal was not in a courthouse. It was at our mother's kitchen, months after the funeral, when the adagio of cleaning had slowed and the casseroles had all gone cold under foil. My brother stood by the sink with sleeves rolled, washing a coffee mug he never meant to rinse when she was alive. He said, casual as a man asking about the weather, that the estate paperwork had gone smooth, and I could skip the clerk's office if I wanted to. He had his tired smile on, the one that used to make our mother forgive him for arriving late to Sunday roast with stories, instead of apologies. I nodded and said thank you, and then I watched his eyes when he dried the rim of that mug and set it down just a fraction too carefully. I have listened to engines long enough to know when a sound is being covered up. Quiet tells on people. I went to the clerk anyway. The records room is never warm in our county. The air holds dust and something like chalk. If you are respectful, the women there will glide you through the microfilm and index books the way an aunt would guide you through a family album. The clerk on duty wore a sweater with a small snag on one sleeve. She retrieved our file, set the packet on the table. Everything look right? She asked. It did not, but I made my face say it did until I was alone in my truck. And then I laughed one time, low, a sound with no humor in it. It was the laugh of a man recognizing an old pattern sewn with new thread. The waiver was there, the one that said I renounced my interest in our parents' property. Under it, my name, walking around in a suit it hadn't earned. When you've carried someone through their mistakes, you learn the weight of them. Years ago, I paid the tax lien he forgot to pay because he was restructuring. I rewired his garage when the breaker box dated back to governors I barely recalled. I drove his wife to the clinic and sat in the parking lot while she tried not to cry, because he'd borrowed for a business that never learned to stand up. I let his insults slide about how I never had the guts to take risks, about how being a notary was just a pen and a stamp, because I thought I could hold the family steady if I didn't rock the boat. I didn't realize that keeping your voice down while a ship takes on water is not the same thing as saving it. I photocopied the waiver. Then I made photographs of the photocopies at 600 dots per inch at the library, because the machines there are better than the ones at home. I slid a cotton glove on my right hand and ran it once across the image as if a ghost of texture might rise. I took out an old check register of mine, the top where carbon copies press a faint echo, and I compared the angle of my capital M. I didn't have to be right to know I was. I only had to be patient enough to let the ink betray its maker. Finding the notary was easier than it should have been. Her name, Paula Hanks, sat under a notary seal too perfect, the starburst a little too crisp. The commission number matched the book. but the embossing on the paper didn't bite deep. For a moment, I thought she might be a friend of his who had let her stamp wander. A short search told me she had moved 3 counties south. I drove 2 hours of late sun and farm fields, a thermos of coffee that tasted like metal because the lid is older than most of my shirts. I found her behind a counter at a UPS store rental, replacing a roll of tape that kept snapping. When I asked about the waiver, I watched her pupils widen and then come back narrow, like an animal in a doorway, measuring daylight. She didn't sign that paper, she said. Careful. She'd lost her stamp a year earlier and reported it. She went into a back room and returned with a photocopy of the report. The date on her report preceded the date on my signature by 6 months. My brother might call you, I said. He might tell you this is a family misunderstanding. She shook her head once. Men who call something a misunderstanding usually mean they wish it would be understood their way. I nodded, gave her my card, and later that night, under a lamp that made everything in the room sit closer to itself, I typed an affidavit for her that only required truth in simple sentences. She signed it in front of a different notary the next day. By then, I had already photographed her old stamp from a copy of a real deed she'd notarized before it went missing, noting the tiny nick in the third ray of the seal, a nick our paper did not have. Ink is cocky until you make it compare itself to the past. I didn't tell my brother. Silence is a better fence than noise when you need to keep things from running wild. Instead, I sent a preservation letter to his attorney Polite, precise, asking them to retain all drafts, inks, printers, and devices used in preparing the waiver, including the files and timestamps. It read like courtesy. It was a net. I scheduled a meeting with a document examiner whose office smelled faintly of toner and eucalyptus. He wore glasses that made his eyes look like he was permanently considering a chessboard. He took one look at the waiver and said, "There are tells." He said it softly, like a man noticing weather. He explained the liftoff strokes that didn't match my historical exemplars. The tremor where a confident line was faked by a slower hand, the pressure pattern inconsistent with my sample signatures collected over decades on bank cards, mortgage papers, even Christmas checks I'd signed for the nieces. He asked for originals. "You'll have them," I said, and the certainty in my voice made me realize how long I'd been waiting to be certain about anything concerning my brother. People romanticize confrontation. They think truth is a sword you swing. It isn't. It's the ground under your feet. I filed a petition to set aside the waiver and to reopen a portion of the estate administration, a clean brief that did not accuse my brother of anything it could not prove. It asked questions I already had answers to. It attached an index like a psalm. Exhibit A, certified copy of prior commission report about the stolen notary stamp. Exhibit B, high-resolution scans of suspect's signature with measured comparisons. Exhibit C, the examiner's preliminary letter. Exhibit D, my historical signature samples, numbered and dated. The judge assigned Harlan, who reads like he was born with red pencil marks on his crib, set a hearing and a timetable for discovery. By the time the papers landed at my brother's house, the ground had already tilted beneath him. He just didn't feel it yet because he was busy telling himself a story where he wins. He called once. The screen lit with his name. I let it go to voicemail. He said he was disappointed, repeated the words so many times it rearranged itself, and I almost laughed again. "You know how Mom wanted us to keep peace," he said. I could hear the clink of ice in a glass afternoon whiskey for courage. He asked why I was dragging strangers into family. The irony occurred to him as he said it, and he paused, then pivoted to promise we would work this out. I saved the message, because sometimes a man's voice says more than his words do, and the law, which he thinks is only words, listens to tone too when a jury is nearby. In the weeks before the hearing, I slept more easily than I had in years. I cooked in my mother's kitchen with the windows cracked to the late summer air, onions softening in the pan with that sweet note they give off when they stop fighting heat. I repaired a loose stair tread and oiled the hinges on the back door that had squealed like a wounded thing. The house settled into itself, and I did too. Every night, before I turned off the lamp, I opened the manila folder and looked at the curve of that false E and felt no anger, only a calm like smooth water. I thought of my father, who built this house with his own hands and taught me to square a frame by diagonals and not by the way it looked. "It's not about looking right," he'd said once, pencil behind his ear, sun in his hair. "It's about being right." The morning of the hearing, I pressed a shirt that had been in my closet so long it knew the shape of my shoulders. The sun was slow and kind through the kitchen window. I buttered toast the way my mother taught me corner to corner, no bare patches, and ate standing up like a man who wants to move but knows patience is a better breakfast. I put the folder in a leather portfolio I hadn't used since the days when people asked me for my stamp because they trusted me, not because they needed me to make a lie look official. I drove downtown with the radio off, letting the tires hum out their low song. The hallway before a hearing is the longest room in any building. Time stretches inside it. People practice their faces. I sat with my back straight and my portfolio on my knees and watched dust float like soft ash in the fluorescent light. My brother arrived in a navy jacket he hadn't earned, the shoulders too tight, his tie chosen like a guess. He looked at me once and then away, which is all a man needs to do to tell you what he can't stand to see. His attorney spoke with quick hands. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the story. The notary wouldn't show. The notary would be unavailable. The notary had moved away. That would have been a good card if the deck hadn't changed while they weren't looking. I watched their shoes. Confidence speaks in shoes more honestly than in mouths. My brother's soles were new and slick. His attorneys were expensive and worn at the outer heel. The bailiff called another case. A woman cried into a tissue and then stopped, composed by her own exhaustion. Someone's phone vibrated like a trapped insect and fell silent. The clock above the water fountain paused between seconds the way cheap clocks do. When the clerk called our case, I stood. My knees made no sound. I carried the portfolio with the weight you give to something steady, not precious, like a set of tools you've owned long enough to know what each can do. We stepped toward the door together, my brother and I, two boys grown old, carrying the shape of the same surname, into a room where names put on suits and sat under seal. He opened his mouth as if to speak to me, and then he closed it, a rare wisdom moving over him like shade. I put my hand on the brass handle, cool from the air, and thought of our mother's hand on my shoulder the day I left for my first job at the bank, her voice low and certain. Don't let anybody hurry your honesty. Inside, Judge Harlan would sit with his pen angled like a plumb line. Inside, the notary's affidavit would wait pink-cheeked in the file. Inside, the stare of the document examiner would settle on our paper, like weather that has finally arrived. My brother's lawyer would ask for postponements and find his pockets empty. Things that had been said in kitchens would be measured by words that have to hold still. In a few minutes, I would unzip the portfolio and the room would see my name wearing a costume and recognize the lazy stitchwork. But for a breath longer, I let the hallway hold me. I heard my brother whisper behind me, low and pitched to sound brave. She won't show up. I pushed the door open and walked into the light with his forged signature in my hand. And for the first time in years, I let my silence do the talking. I have always believed that betrayal doesn't strike like lightning. It seeps, slow as water through a crack in the roof, staining the ceiling long before anyone admits there's a hole. After the first hearing, I carried that thought with me the way a man carries a pebble in his shoe, not painful, but impossible to forget. The judge had not decided yet. No hammer had come down, but my brother's smile was gone, and with it the easy arrogance that once fit his face like a mask. He knew I had a case, though he still pretended otherwise. Pretending was his only gift. Driving home, the courthouse shrinking behind me, I let my mind circle back to years before the signatures and filings. I remembered the times I'd covered his debts with my own savings. I remembered him bringing me a crumpled notice about unpaid property taxes, eyes wide with practiced helplessness. I had fixed it. I always fixed it. Mother had believed in him long after Father had stopped. Father once muttered to me while chopping wood, "Your brother mistakes a lifeline for a rope he can climb." At the time, I thought it was just an old man's bitterness. But now I knew. I carried their house, the one my father built, board by board as a kind of covenant. My brother carried it like an opportunity. That was the difference. I didn't shout. I didn't confront. That has never been my way. Instead, I let silence do the heavy work. Silence unsettles people who live by noise. My brother needed chaos to cover his fraud. I gave him none. At night, I sat at the kitchen table, arranging papers like a mason laying bricks. Every photocopy, every affidavit, every timestamp report became a stone. My plan was not to crush him. It was to build something so solid that when he tried to lean against it, he'd break his own shoulder. I reached out to a handwriting examiner, a woman whose eyes never seemed to blink. She studied the waiver for less than 5 minutes before saying, "This isn't yours, it's his attempt at you." She spoke the way a surgeon points at a tumor on an x-ray. Direct, calm, certain. Her written report became Exhibit F in my growing file. I placed it behind the notary's affidavit, careful to keep the edges neat. A neat file is more dangerous than a loud argument. During those weeks, I remembered our childhood with new clarity. My brother and I had once shared a room where the ceiling leaked in winter. I would place pots beneath the drips, while he slept with the blanket over his head. Even then, I was repairing. He was ignoring. Mother used to say, "Edward, you were born old." She meant steady, patient, slow to speak. My brother was the opposite, restless, charming, reckless. That difference had once balanced us. Now it divided us like a river. I did not hate him. That surprises people. I pitied him, in a way, but pity does not mean surrender. He tried to rattle me. Letters arrived at my door, each more desperate than the last. First polite, then sharp, then pleading. One said, "If you pursue this, you'll ruin the family name." Another said, "We can settle this quietly. You take a smaller share, I'll make it worth your while." I placed each letter in a separate sleeve, labeling them by date. In court, desperation is as valuable as ink. He even sent an old friend to speak on his behalf, a man I hadn't seen in decades. Over coffee, the friend leaned forward and said, "He regrets what happened. He just doesn't know how to undo it without losing face." I stirred my coffee and replied, "Losing face is lighter than losing truth." That ended the conversation. Discovery began. His lawyer had to turn over drafts of documents. Each draft carried fingerprints not literal, but in the form of metadata. Dates, times, usernames. Technology betrays the careless more brutally than handwriting does. The examiner's report highlighted inconsistencies. The notary's affidavit confirmed negligence or worse. Together they formed a lattice my brother couldn't climb. I did not gloat. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking tea in the dim light, listening to the old clock tick. Revenge, I discovered, isn't fire. It's ice. It doesn't flare. It freezes, inch by inch, until the other man realizes he cannot move. At the second hearing, my brother looked smaller. His tie was crooked, his eyes restless. He whispered too often to his attorney. When the handwriting expert testified, his shoulders sank. The judge listened, pen tapping faintly. Each fact settled into the room like a weight. My brother's forged signature, once a weapon, had become an anchor dragging him under. When my turn came, I spoke softly. I described my role as notary for decades, my knowledge of my own hand. I did not embellish. The truth required no decoration. My brother's attorney objected once weekly. The judge overruled without looking up. Afterward, I sat in my truck, hands on the steering wheel. I realized revenge had already taken root inside me, changing me. I no longer looked at my brother as a rival. He was simply a man standing in quicksand, waving his arms. My silence had become the water filling around him, and yet I felt tired. Revenge is heavy, carrying proof, arranging strategies, sitting still while others squirm it weighs on a man. But dignity is heavier still, and I was not about to set mine down. One evening, he came to my house. He knocked 3 short raps, impatient. I opened the door to see him standing on the porch, hair uncombed, face pale. He said nothing at first, just looked past me into the hallway, like he was searching for something to hold on to. Finally, he whispered, "Why are you doing this?" I could have listed reasons: the forgery, the betrayal, the years of sacrifice ignored. Instead, I answered with only one line: "Because my name belongs to me." He blinked, as if struck by something simple and immovable. Then he turned, descended the steps, and walked into the night without another word. I knew the trial would drag on. The law is slow, like an old clock pendulum. But I also knew momentum was mine. Every exhibit, every affidavit, every silent moment in court chipped away at him. He still thought he might talk his way out. He still believed charm could save him. But charm does not erase ink. It does not erase silence that has hardened into evidence. As I watched the autumn leaves fall in the yard, I knew this was only the beginning. His downfall would not be swift. It would be slow, deliberate, as patient as the silence I had chosen all my life. And when it came, I would not need to raise my voice. Depositions I learned long ago are not about answers. They are about breath. The person who controls the pace controls the shape of the truth. When the notice arrived, date, time, location, was a conference room with a view of the parking lot where birds hopped between windshields. I set the paper down on my mother's kitchen table and let my lungs decide how the next month would go. Slow in, slow out. I wasn't interested in winning by spectacle. I wanted the law to do what a level does when you set it on a bowed board. Let the bubble show where the warp lives. My brother called the night before his deposition, a number I recognized made strange by the hour. "We can settle," he said, voice dented and thin. "No need to drag good people into this. Paula, the notary, she won't show up anyway. He was repeating an old line to a room that had changed wallpaper. "She already has," I said. "On paper. Under oath." Silence. Then the sound of ice sliding in glass. Then a click. I put the phone down and breathed through the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint sugar smell that kitchen wood still gives off when it remembers summer. The portfolio on the table lay closed, a calm animal. Inside, ink waited with the patience of stone. The deposition room ran cool, as if air conditioning were a tactic. Fluorescents hummed like bees with nowhere better to be. A wall calendar still showed a month back. The court reporter sat upright, hands poised above a machine that looked both modern and 19th century. Her nails were unpainted. She had the steady look of someone who has watched truths unspool. So slowly they look like thread, until you see the garment they've been making. My brother wore a blue jacket that didn't know his shoulders. His lawyer, a man whose cufflinks were the only honest thing about him, arranged papers like a dealer who believed in luck. Across the table, my attorney slid me a legal pad, though my notes were done months ago. I nodded, not because I needed the gesture, but because manners are a form of war the other side rarely trains for. They swore him in. He raised his right hand, palm open like a boy promising to wash before dinner. The reporter read the oath in a tone that said oaths are not about performance. Then we began. Questions that sounded soft enough to lie to. Dates, locations, who wrote which draft, who pressed print. He said he didn't remember. He said he thought I'd signed the waiver in a rush at the kitchen, like memory could turn forged ink into holiday gravy. "The notary," my attorney said, voice level. "Tell us about her." He started, and found nothing on the shelf where his story had lived. She moved away. "Before or after she reported her stamp stolen?" my attorney asked. My brother blinked, slow. The court reporter's keys whispered, "I don't know." We laid exhibits down one by one. The affidavit from Paula. Not the villain he'd cast, but a woman with a clean desk and a precise conscience. The commission number. The notice of loss. The date that undercut his favorite lie, the way a frost kills an early blossom. The printout of yellow microdots tiny, nearly invisible to a casual eye whose pattern a forensic analyst had mapped to a specific desktop printer model and serial. They lay on the table like the smallest meteorology, weather arriving from a sky my brother had believed he controlled. He tried a new tact. "Family understands family," he said, as if he were delivering something profound. "This is embarrassing for all of us. Why put mother's name in the same sentence as fraud?" My attorney did not look at him. He looked at the reporter. "Off the question," he murmured, and returned to the list. "Show us your handwriting samples," he said, and slid a sheet toward him with instructions a teacher might give a boy who never finished his penmanship workbook. "Write this sentence, write that date, sign your name 3 times with your usual hand." My brother's hand shook a little, then leveled out. He wrote his name in the version of himself he liked best. The D loomed with that loop he couldn't help. The tail of the Y curved like a habit you thought you had hidden and didn't. Across from me, the document examiner spectacles that made his gaze a steady weight watched without interest. A man taking weather. When it ended, and the reporter's machine finally stilled, my brother looked at me for the first time mid-room, an old look dressed in new worry. "This will ruin me," he said low. "No," I said, standing. "You did that work years ago. This just lets you read it." I drove home under a sky that looked scrubbed. The soybeans along County 12 had gone that late summer color that has its own vocabulary of green. It smelled like warm dust and something faintly metallic from the old mill. I rolled down the window and let the air move through the truck as if it were cleaning it. In the passenger seat, the portfolio sat belted in like a careful child. The world felt honest in a way it rarely does when you're carrying a case. Even the gas pump handle clicked off at the right second, no spill, no spit back, just finished. That night, I took the printer report back out. The tiny yellow dots, printer, steganography, hardly anyone knows exists, recorded date and time like seeds in a row. The analyst's letter explained it clean as a recipe. Model, serial, the cadence of the dots matching the cadence of prints made on a Tuesday night at 9:43 p.m., 3 days after my mother's funeral, when my brother had told me he was too broken to find the checkbook, much less stand in a room with a machine humming in blue light. The dots don't accuse, they simply point. I had asked the manufacturer for the registered owner. A subpoena did the asking for me. The reply came. The unit was purchased to a business account, my brother's LLC, the one he'd used to buy a leather chair and a glass desk he never sat at. Men build offices like altars and then pray for money instead of mercy. In the same week, the clerk rubber-stamped my list pendants. The stamp thumped the paper with that deep-bodied sound only old ink gives. A notice in the land records that says, simply, "You don't get to sell what we're asking a court to straighten." I didn't parade. I placed the certified copy in the portfolio and boiled eggs, yolks just turning to jam, ate two with salt. Revenge is not a meal, but when you've been force-fed humiliation for a year, honesty has flavor. He tried his own filings. A motion to dismiss that read like a man trying to convince himself gravity could be argued with. He attached a letter from one of Mother's friends claiming I had always said I didn't care about the house. The friend, warned by errands and time, called me herself the next day to say she hadn't read what she signed. His wife had explained it. I told her I would never put her on a stand unless she wished to correct the record. She cried not from fear, but relief, and sent a short handwritten statement she asked the librarian to notarize. The loop of her G was as old as the town. You can tell when ink has lived a life. The community knows things without gossip. They read the way men carry themselves into the hardware store. They read who lingers in the parking lot of the bank with a phone pressed too close to his ear. They see which shoulders slope. In the diner on the square where pancakes risk being too generous for the plates, heads lifted a degree when I walked in. Not pity, not triumph, just acknowledgement. I nodded at the same old men who'd argued the same old fishing spot since I had hair thick as broomcorn. Edna, behind the counter, refilled my coffee without asking. "Your brother was in here," she said, making conversation out of the weather. "Ordered eggs over hard, sent them back." "Maybe he meant soft," I said. "He means whatever he can get away with," she said, then colored, as if she'd stepped on something delicate. "Sorry, that came out wrong." It came out exactly the way you meant it, Edna," I said. "That's a kind of mercy." She squeezed my forearm briefly, a hand that had served coffee for 40 years, saying what words clutter. Men think their reputations are what they say about themselves. Towns know better. We scheduled another hearing. The judge wanted to address the discovery fight my brother had started by not producing the home computer. He said it crashed, that a cousin wiped it, that a tech recycled it. Men tell stories about machines when they are afraid of machines telling stories about them. The judge, whose patience is a landscape you only notice when you're miles across it, asked simple questions that made complicated lies look stupid. "Counsel," he said, "explain how your client both had a crash and managed to recycle before notifying opposing counsel in a case where the contents of that machine are central." He was distraught, the lawyer said. "We all are," the judge answered. "Produce what you have. Yesterday would be on time." We left with a new order, tight as a knot. On the courthouse steps, a breeze moved the small flag by the clerk's door and made a sound like paper being turned, which, if you believe in a certain kind of poetry, felt like the day editing itself. That afternoon, I carried a box from my truck up the front steps of the house my father built. Inside the box, Mother's recipe cards. The last set I'd find in a drawer I thought I'd already cleaned. Her hand square, practical, unfussy, had written ingredients as if nothing in the world were more reliable than a cup, a teaspoon, a low oven. On the back of one card, a list of phone numbers. The church, the plumber, my name, my brother's. Next to mine, Edward always comes. I sat at the table and let that sentence breathe in the room. The card smelled of nutmeg and old paper. I didn't cry. Some truths lift you rather than wring you. I turned the radio to a baseball game soft enough to be weather, sliced apples for a pie, mixed flour and fat until it looked like something that could forgive heat. In the oven, the crust blistered slightly, the kitchen sweetening into the earliest evenings of my life. I left the back door open to the screen and listened to leaves consider the wind. The house did not care about court. Houses care about hands. The printer evidence did more than narrow the who. It told the when. That timestamp on the yellow dots, 9:43 p.m., let me call a different witness. Mrs. Kiefer down the block walked every night with a flashlight she never turned on. She liked knowing it was there and not needing it. She remembered my brother's truck idling in his driveway at 9:30 that night, exhaust making a little fog in the streetlight. He told her he was heading to the office to clean up paperwork. He said it twice. She told me, as if the second time were rehearsal for a judge. We didn't need her to be devastating. We needed her to be ordinary. She was. The best witnesses wear shoes with sensible soles. We also subpoenaed the UPS store camera across from his office. Their retention policy was a month, long blown by the time I started this fight. But their franchise owner had a habit of backing up to a personal drive, because he thought, clouds are where storms happen. He had 4 nights of older footage he'd saved the week his nephew visited, including Tuesday. The pixelation was a kind of mercy faces turned to geometry, but you can still see a man carry a ream of paper to a car that knows his key fob. You can see pause, hesitation, the small posture of someone who believes no one sees him. The timestamp matched the printer dots within a minute. Not a dagger, a pin, but a quilt is made of them. A settlement conference came and went like a bad song on a radio you cannot switch off. The judge, patient to the point of art, asked us in separate rooms what we wanted that the law couldn't give. My list was short and rude to no one. Void the waiver, restore the record, reimburse fees and costs, admit the forgery on paper so the next man in line to be hurt by him can read and decide for himself. Do you want damages? My lawyer asked, because lawyers must. I want the House to stop hearing lies, I said. Money is only a way to measure whether a man has learned anything. My brother's demands were elastic. First, he wanted me to accept a smaller share. Then he wanted me to promise not to use the word forgery anywhere but in my head. Then he wanted me to apologize for dragging family through court. He wanted so many things it looked like one itself was his only fixed point. We left with nothing signed. Sometimes the absence of an agreement is the neatest signature on a day. That night he sent me a text message long enough to be proof of grammar failing a man. The kind men sin when they believe length can do what honesty refuses to. I didn't answer. I printed it instead, the ink still damp, and slid it into a plastic sleeve. He had ended it with, "You win, happy now," as if victory were a shape I cared to hold. I slept 8 hours and dreamed of a floor joist settling correctly into a pocket cut to fit it. The next hearing was small on the calendar and large in consequence. A motion for sanctions on spoliation, the court's long word for destroying what you were duty-bound to preserve. I didn't want punishment. I wanted the court to say out loud what had been happening in whispers. When you erase a machine, you confess something you don't have the courage to write. The judge heard argument like a man listening for squeaks in a newly hung door. He asked few questions. He wrote a short order that felt heavier than its word count. Adverse inference as to the contents of the missing computer. Fees to me for the cost of seeking what should never have been hidden. Outside, my brother's attorney's smile changed shape. He had the look of a man who discovered the expensive car he leased came without brakes. My brother kept his eyes on the concrete as we walked toward the same door from opposite directions. His mouth twitched like it wanted to say my name and couldn't quite find it. The door handle was warm from the sun on the glass. I held it open for a woman carrying a baby, and she said, "Thank you, sir," in a voice you remember when you try to be angry again later. I went home the long way. There's a stretch of road beyond the gravel pit where the ditch blooms with chicory. So blue it looks like the sky fell and grew stems. I pulled over and looked at those flowers as if they had something to teach me about modesty. A truck passed and lifted a brief cloud of dust. It hung, then settled on everything equally. The wildflowers, the weeds, the fence posts. That's what the truth does, I thought. It doesn't pick favorites. It just lands. He came one last time without an appointment. Evening. Porch light not yet necessary but switched on anyway. He stood at the bottom step, hands in his pockets, a boy stance on a man frame. "You're going to break me," he said. "No," I answered from the top step, my voice the speed of a thought you've already had. "I'm going to let the thing you built fall where it stands." He looked past me into the hallway again, as if mother might walk out with a towel over her shoulder and call us both inside to mind our manners. All that came was the smell of baked apples cooling on the counter. His eyes shone, not with tears, but with effort. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," I said, "and not to me, to the court." He put a foot on the bottom step and then set it back down. I heard the night insects begin their choir. He nodded, a shallow dip of the head that, from anyone else, would have counted as understanding. From him, it was just the end of a muscle's energy. He walked back to his car and drove away like a man whose hands hurt. I went inside, turned off the porch light, and stood a moment in the warm dark. The refrigerator motor clicked on, a sound like a promise kept. I sliced 2 pieces of pie, wrapped one, and wrote his name in neat letters on a strip of tape. I set it on a plate near the door. He would not take it, but the house felt better knowing it had been offered. Trial was still weeks out, but seasons turn long before the calendar admits it. In the yard, the first maple leaf crisped at the edges like a warning from August to October. I swept the steps, oiled the front door lock so the key slid without negotiation, and greased the gears on the old storm window latches before the mornings demanded them. Inside, I stacked my exhibits one last time and slip-sheeted the few that got tugged. The portfolio closed without complaint. When I turned out the kitchen light, the room kept a softer version of itself in the window glass. My face, older than it ever felt, hovered there for a second with my father's jaw and my mother's eyes. I said goodnight out loud to an empty house that, in all the ways that matter, was finally listening. Outside, the crickets tuned themselves. Somewhere down the block, a dog settled with a long sigh. I lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling's old cracks, the ones we'd always meant to fix and never did, because they were honest. Tomorrow would be another day of lists, another day of measured breath. The downfall he had started would proceed like weather no hurry, no pause, just arrival. And when it did, it wouldn't need my voice to explain itself. The morning of trial felt nothing like a storm. It felt like a slow tide, inevitable, steady, moving even while the surface looked still. I woke before the alarm, listened to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen, the house settling into its old beams, and thought of my father sharpening tools before dawn. He never hurried the edge on a blade. He let the whetstone do the work, quiet, even certain. That was the way I intended to walk into court. The courthouse smelled the same as it always did: old wood polish, floor wax, and something faintly metallic that clung to the air like coins. People often think the law is about arguments, but it's really about records, and records carry their own perfume. When I walked in, my brother was already seated at counsel's table. He had chosen a lighter suit this time, tan with a faint pattern, as if cloth could make him trustworthy. His lawyer spoke low into his ear. My brother nodded too quickly, a man trying to swallow advice without chewing. I set my portfolio down with both hands, the way you set down a brick you've carried for years. My attorney leaned toward me and whispered, "This is where the silence pays off." He was right. His lawyer went first, pacing slowly, words dressed in sympathy. He painted my brother as a grieving son who had tried to settle the estate quickly, too quickly, making innocent mistakes. "This is not fraud," he said, hand on the table like a preacher. "This is family, confused and overwhelmed." I watched the jurors. Their eyes stayed polite but blank. They've all heard sermons before. When my attorney stood, he didn't pace. He stayed rooted, voice level. He did not accuse. He invited. "You will see a document," he said, "with a signature that does not belong to the man sitting beside me. You will hear from a notary who never signed it, whose stamp was stolen months earlier. You will see yellow dots, tiny, invisible to the naked eye, that tell you exactly when and where the page was printed. You will hear from experts, and you will hear from Edward Mallory, a man who knows his own hand, and who spent his life notarizing documents so others could trust their family's future. Ask yourselves, would a man who spent his life preserving truth abandon his own name so easily? The room fell into a silence so deep even the bailiff seemed to breathe quieter. The first witness was Paula, the notary. She sat straight, hands folded, voice calm. She explained losing her stamp, reporting it, receiving a replacement. She explained how she never notarized any waiver for me, how the stamp on the document lacked the unique nick she knew by heart. His lawyer tried to rattle her. "Are you sure you didn't forget? People misremember all the time." She looked at him like he had asked if she'd forgotten her own name. "Sir," she said, "notaries don't forget commissions. They live by them." Her words sat in the air like nails hammered flush. Next came the handwriting examiner. He wore spectacles that magnified his calm. He pointed to the large chart behind him where my authentic signatures hung next to the forged one. "The hesitation here," he said, tapping a red circle, "indicates a slow, careful attempt to mimic. Authentic signatures flow, forged ones crawl. The loop of the deed in Mallory, see this, is characteristic of the defendant's natural hand, not Edward's. You cannot erase habit with pretense." Jurors leaned forward. Even the judge scribbled a note. Finally, the printer analyst testified. He showed the dots magnified until they looked like constellations. "This code is invisible under normal light," he explained. "But every page printed carries a map, time, date, and printer serial. This waiver came from a machine purchased to the defendant's business account on Tuesday at 9:43 p.m., 3 days after his mother's funeral." The words landed with the sound of a gavel even before one fell. When they called me, I stood steady. I did not dress my voice in drama. I spoke the way I notarized for decades, precise, calm, unhurried. "I did not sign that paper," I said. "I would never sign away the house my father built with his own hands. My signature is mine. It belongs to my history, to my children, to my work. When I looked at the waiver, I saw my name, but not my hand. And that difference," I paused, eyes steady on the jurors, "is the difference between truth and theft." His lawyer tried to trap me in small questions. "Isn't it possible you signed quickly, distracted, in grief?" "No, I said simply. I've signed my name thousands of times. It has memory. It doesn't change in grief. He frowned, shuffled his papers, and moved on. During recess, I stood by the window. Outside, children ran across the courthouse lawn chasing each other, laughter carried by wind. Inside, silence held. My brother avoided my gaze. He spoke too much to his lawyer, words spilling, hands restless. I remembered when we were boys, running those same lawns after school, mother's voice calling us home. He always ran faster. But running doesn't always mean winning. His lawyer pleaded exhaustion, confusion, a man who made mistakes while mourning. He begged the jury not to ruin a life over a technicality. My attorney did not beg. He said, "This case is not about mistakes. It is about intent. It is about a man who tried to erase his own brother by stealing his name. Forgery is not confusion. It is clarity, the clarity of deceit." He let the silence after that sentence stretch long. Silence tells jurors what words cannot. We waited. Hours passed slowly when 12 strangers weigh years of your life. I sat with my hands folded, feeling the grain of the wooden bench under my palms. My brother fidgeted, whispering to his lawyer. The portfolio lay at my feet, heavier with the weight of the truth it carried. When the jury filed back, the air changed. Everyone knew. You can feel a verdict before you hear it. Forgery, the foreman said. The waiver is void. The estate to be corrected. Costs awarded. The words did not ring like victory. They rang like restoration, like a chair leg set back on even floorboards. My brother slumped, face pale, eyes darting like a man searching for an exit in a room with only walls. Outside, the air smelled of rain though the sky was clear. I walked down the courthouse steps, each footfall lighter than I expected. Reporters asked questions. I said nothing. Silence was my only statement. Back home, I unlocked the door and stepped into the house. The same creak in the floorboard by the entry greeted me. The same smell of wood and dust. It was mine again, not by conquest, but by correction. I set the portfolio on the table. For the first time in months, I didn't open it. I let it rest, like a tool finally put back in its drawer. I poured a glass of water, drank it slowly, and looked out the window at the maple tree Father planted the year I was born. Its branches swayed gently, as if nodding. Justice is not lap. It is a tree that keeps growing, even after storms. But victory, I knew, was not the end. Reputation lingers. My brother's downfall had only begun. He had debts, secrets, and a community that now saw through his charm. And I, silent as ever, would watch the unraveling continue not by my hands, but by the weight of what he had already done to himself. The silence would finish the work. The verdict was paper, but the echo was stone. By the time the clerk stamped it, the sound had already traveled farther than my brother ever intended. Our town isn't large, and news moves faster than tires on gravel. By nightfall, neighbors knew. By morning, it was on the radio's legal blotter, just beneath a segment on harvest yields. I didn't speak of it. I didn't need to. Silence, once again, was louder than his words. Within a week, the bank froze his credit line. They cited pending legal exposure in neat letters that look polite until you read them twice. His business, if you could call a desk, a chair, and a leased copier a business, relied on loans more than income. He tried to apply elsewhere, but banks whispered to one another like old farmers at a feed store. The answer was always no. He called me one evening, his voice thin. "You could stop this," he said. "No," I answered. "The bank stopped itself. I only told the truth." He hung up. I sat with the receiver still warm, then set it back in its cradle, steady. The church pews told their own story. He had once walked in late, laughing, hand on someone's shoulder, shaking the pastor's hand with practiced warmth. Now he slipped into the back row, head down. People didn't scowl. They didn't shout. They simply didn't speak to him. Silence is worse than gossip. Gossip at least remembers you. Silence erases. At the diner, I saw him once. He ordered toast and coffee, though he used to order a plate so full it needed 2 waitresses to carry. Edna refilled his mug without comment. He tried to strike up small talk with the men at the counter. They nodded, polite, but turned back to their plates. He looked around as though the air itself had betrayed him. The judge's order corrected the record. My name stood where it should have been from the start. The house was mine in law, not just in memory. But the ruling also carried fees and costs. Those were his to pay. He delayed. He begged extensions. But court orders don't beg back. Liens followed. His truck, newer, shiny, meant to be proof of his success, was the first to go. The repo man hauled it from his driveway at dawn. Neighbors watched through curtains. He stood on the porch in a shirt too wrinkled, shouting at men who didn't answer. Machines don't negotiate, they only tow. Later, his office lease ended. The landlord, a man who once bragged about how much charm my brother carried, replaced the lock before noon. By sunset, the glass door bore a new name. I didn't celebrate. I tended the house, I oiled the hinges, swept the porch, planted winter rye in the garden beds, because that's what Father used to do after harvest to give the soil rest and cover. Revenge can be noisy, but dignity is quiet. At night, I sat by the window, lamp low, reading the old recipe cards Mother wrote. One in her square hand said, "Apple cake, Edward likes." I smiled, folded it, and slipped it back into the box. These were the things worth keeping. One afternoon, I walked past the courthouse square. My brother was there, arguing with a clerk about filing something new. His voice carried, high and desperate. The clerk shook her head, patient but immovable. He turned, saw me, and his face shifted anger, then shame, then something hollow. He walked toward me fast. For a moment, I thought he might raise his fist. But when he stopped a foot away, all he said was, "You've destroyed me." I looked at him, steady. "No," I said, "you destroyed yourself. I just stepped out of the way so everyone else could see." His lips parted, but no words came. He turned, shoulders sagging, and walked off across the square, a man shrinking into his own shadow. In small towns, reputation is currency. His was bankrupt now. Invitations dried up. The Rotary didn't ask him back. The Chamber of Commerce quietly struck his name from their list. Even the softball team he sponsored replaced his company logo with a local feed store's. One neighbor told me later, it wasn't the forgery that did him in. It was that he thought he could lie to all of us, and we wouldn't notice. Folks forgive failure. They don't forgive pretending. That was true, and it was punishment deeper than any fine. At night, I walked the halls of the house. Father's hammer still hung in the shed, its handle polished smooth from years of grip. Mother's curtains still caught the breeze. Their presence filled the rooms in ways no court order could give or take away. I thought of my brother not as an enemy, but as a boy once sleeping on the bunk above mine, dreaming of running faster than anyone. He had always been chasing speed. I had always been planting roots. In the end, roots outlast feet. Letters from creditors arrived at his door. He ignored them. Then came the sheriff's notices, tacked with tape that peeled paint when removed. His yard grew wild. He stopped mowing. His eyes, once sharp with schemes, dulled. People said he started drinking earlier in the day. I didn't rejoice. I didn't visit. Revenge wasn't about watching him crumble. It was about restoring what he tried to take. The rest was his own doing. Weeks later, I saw him outside the grocery. He carried a paper sack half empty, just bread and eggs. His shoulders were bent, his face pale. When he saw me, he paused. For the first time in years, there was no bravado, no smile, no pretense, only fatigue. "I never thought you had it in you," he said. I met his eyes. "It was never about having it in me," I answered. "It was about you underestimating silence." He nodded once, a small broken gesture, and shuffled away. At home, I baked the apple cake, the kitchen filled with warmth, cinnamon in the air. I cut one slice, left it on a plate at the far end of the table, as if for someone expected but not coming. I ate my own piece slowly, savoring not victory, but peace. Justice is not about winning. It's about setting things back where they belong. The estate was corrected, the property restored, my name intact. But one thing remained, the final, public sealing of the record, the moment when the court would publish its decision, permanent and undeniable. That would be the last chapter of his collapse, etched, not in rumor, not in whispers, but in law. And when that day came, I would walk into the courtroom once more, not to fight, but to witness the end of a story he began with ink that wasn't his. The calendar moved slow but steady toward the last hearing. It wasn't about argument anymore. It was about finality. The judge would publish his written decision, enter it into the permanent record, and close the case. My brother had filed his last desperate motions, each thinner than the last, and each denied. The ink was already dry on the truth. This was only the ceremony of acknowledgement. I woke that morning with a strange calm. For months I had carried documents like armor, walked into rooms heavy with history, stood across from a man who wore my last name like a weapon. Now the end was in sight. The fight was no longer mine. It belonged to the record books. The courthouse steps felt different that day. Not lighter, just finished, as if each stone knew it had done its duty. Inside, the same wax smell, the same echo of shoes in the hallway. But I felt it as memory instead of burden. My brother was already there, seated at the far table. His suit was wrinkled, his tie slack, his hair thinning faster than time should have allowed. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, at the table, anywhere but the bench where truth would be spoken aloud. The gallery was sparse, just a few townsfolk, curious enough to witness the final moment. Edna from the diner was there, apron still on. A pair of men from the Rotary sat with folded arms. No one spoke to my brother. Their silence was verdict enough. Judge Harlan entered, robes heavy, face calm. He shuffled his papers with the slow precision of a man who knows the weight of each word. The clerk called the case. The judge began. This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, the exhibits. His voice carried through the quiet room. No rush, no wasted syllable. Forgery is a crime against truth itself. It is not merely ink on paper. It is an attempt to erase a man's name, and with it, his dignity. He paused, looked over his glasses at my brother, then at me. Edward Mallory did not sign that waiver. The signature is void. The notary stamp was stolen. The document was fabricated. This court hereby restores Edward Mallory's lawful interest in the estate property. Costs are awarded. Sanctions are affirmed. Let the record show. Truth stands. The words entered the permanent record like iron hammered into stone. No one applauded. No one shouted. The silence was deeper than sound. My brother sagged into his chair. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but it looked more like a formality than comfort. He whispered something, but my brother didn't nod. He just stared at the grain of the wooden table as if it might open and swallow him. When the hearing ended, the bailiff called the next case. People shifted. My brother remained seated, hollow, while I stood. I collected my portfolio lighter now, not with fewer papers, but with their work completed. As I walked past him, he lifted his eyes. They were red, not from tears, but from sleeplessness. He whispered, barely audible, "You've taken everything." I stopped, turned just enough to look him in the eye and said, "Number, you gave it away." Then I walked out. Outside, the sky was sharp blue, the kind that makes shadows stand crisp. I breathed deep. For the first time in years, my name felt weightless again. Not victorious, not proud, just right. Like a picture finally hung level on the wall. The town adjusted quickly. Within days, his name disappeared from committees, from business listings, from the sponsorship plaques at the ball field. The bank foreclosed on his office building. His truck was gone, his house soon after. He moved into a rental by the edge of town, paint peeling, grass knee-high. At church, he stopped coming altogether. At the diner, he no longer sat by the window. People said he kept to himself, nursing bitterness, waiting for an apology that would never arrive. But even bitterness needs an audience, and his had vanished. I poured my time into the house, repaired the porch railing, sanded the banister father's hands once held, repainted mother's kitchen walls the same pale yellow she'd loved. I moved slowly, deliberately, each repair not just for wood and nails but for memory. One afternoon, while oiling the shed door hinges, I found father's old toolbox beneath a tarp. His initials were carved on the lid. Inside, wrenches worn smooth, a hammer handle shiny from decades of grip. Tools last when they're cared for. So do names. I placed the hammer on the workbench, rested my hand on it, and whispered, "It's safe now." Weeks later, a letter arrived. His handwriting messy, hurried, desperate. "Edward," it began. "You won. Congratulations. You are always the quiet one, the patient one. I thought silence was weakness. Turns out it was the only strength that mattered. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I want it. But I had to write this because I can't stand being invisible anymore. You'll never answer this, but at least I've said it. I was wrong." I read it twice. Then I folded it, placed it in the back of the recipe box, behind Mother's apple cake card. Not as forgiveness, not as reconciliation, simply as a reminder, lies rot, truth lasts. Months passed. The seasons shifted. Autumn leaves fell. Winter wind rattled the shutters. Spring softened the ground again. Through it all, the house stood steady. So did I. One evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon gold. The neighborhood was quiet, only the sound of cicadas starting their chorus. I thought of the long road behind me, the forged signature, the depositions, the hearings, the silences that spoke louder than words. And I thought of the road ahead, calmer, slower, filled with simple repairs and mornings of peace. Justice had come, not as thunder, but as steady rain. It had washed away the lie, leaving only the foundation that was always there. I lifted my cup, sipped, and whispered into the quiet, "It's done." The porch light flickered on as the evening deepened, casting a warm glow over the steps. Inside, the house waited, full of memory and peace. And I, Edward Mallory, sat in the silence I had carried all my life, silence that had finally, irrevocably spoken.